be our last presentation before the break for lunch. And our speaker will be Christina Kingsbury, who is an artist and an educator. She uses disparate materials and modes of expression. Her work as an artist and an educator is a patchwork process inspired by quilting and storytelling. She has shown how multimedia and installation-based work throughout Ontario since 2000, and graduated from York University in 2005 with an honours BFA in visual art and a minor in environmental studies. Since graduating, Christina has worked extensively as an artist, educator at the Trillium Waldorf School, in public schools and for independent programs. She is a recipient of the Ontario Arts Council's Artist in Education Award, through which she runs arts programs in schools exploring biodiversity, pollination, and native plant gardens through artistic approaches. Her work as an artist and educator consistently engages themes of place, value, and the intersection of ecology and social justice. Her talk is entitled Sowing Seeds, Arts Education and Artists' Projects. So please join me in welcoming Christina Kingsbury.
I'd like to thank Pollination Quilt for inviting me to be here today. I've come to the symposium for the past 4 years and I'm really delighted to be speaking at it this year. So I am going to talk today about my work both as an artist and as an educator. And this work that, as Claire said, engages themes of ecology and place. Specifically, my work in the past 5 years has been centered around native plant gardening and pollination as well. This is that's the thing? Yeah. Okay. I should also mention that my work is craft-based, so I've been using sewing and quilting in all of my projects. In the past 5 years, I've been working site-specifically on projects using both recycled materials and native seeds and plants. And these materials are transformed into temporary installations that are then either planted or allowed to biodegrade. And they're intended to become living habitats for pollinators and for other indigenous wildlife. I do come from a long line of naturalists, and I was also taught to sew and to craft by my mother and my grandmothers. And I really feel that my work is rooted in that history and inspired by it as well. The first project that I did with native seeds was a workshop for the Ontario Arts Council's Spotlight Festival. That was in 2009, and I facilitated this workshop with several artists, including Louisa Kratka, and also a naturalist in Guelph called Couch. In the workshop, we made handmade paper, made from recycled paper, scrap paper, from my own sources, and I also used paper from different commercial and institutional sources as well. And we embedded the paper with native seeds that were native to the Guelph area. We had participants of all different ages. When the paper pieces were dried and finished, we talked a lot about identifying natives, and we also, the participants in the workshop, all embroidered an image of a native plant. Usually it was the plant that the seeds were in the paper, right on the paper. Can anyone identify that one? Call it out. Yeah, that's a New England aster. And that one? That's a butterfly milkweed. Yeah. The focus of the workshop was really to provide an interactive opportunity to foster discussion around native plants, around pollination, and also natural history in an intimate environment. yeah, the participants really varied. I myself at the time was really enthusiastic in learning about native plants, and we had lots of folks who knew a lot about gardening and native plants, and many also who had absolutely no idea what a native plant was or what that meant. So there was some really interesting discussion there. And I want to talk a little bit about sewing and stitching. And part of my reason for using sewing and stitching and quilting and handcraft, is in part to reference a history of women's labor, which I think of as a history of care. Women recycling scraps into their quilts and their sewing items, and also passing on the items themselves, and that kind of knowledge preservation, knowledge sharing. And I really see a link between that kind of knowledge preservation and the practices of farmers and naturalists who save seeds and pass on those traditions and the genetic diversity as well. And part of why I'm inspired by that is I believe that kind of knowledge preservation offers a challenge to us as a culture where we live in a consumer culture where life is commodified, so everything has a dollar value on it, and we see these traditions diminishing quite a bit. So I see the renewal of those traditions as an opportunity to challenge that life is something that can be bought. This is an image of a quilt that we put together at the end of the workshop. Many of those who participated took their seed paper home, and those who didn't, we sewed into a quilt that we later planted. And I thought they turned out really lovely, really beautiful. That's one of our young participants planting the quilt in the local garden. And yeah, my experiments with the seed paper have been really interesting over the past few years. I really had no idea if it would work. When I started out with this idea, I really liked the idea of using the paper, the seed paper, the sewing as a quilt to lay on the ground, but I didn't know if it would actually, the seeds would germinate. So I've been surprised. I've had certainly some disappointments as well as some really pleasant surprises to see that often it does work, not always. And sometimes actually I've found it takes the seeds, maybe they don't germinate the first season, but the following years I start to see other things coming up. In 2010, I received an award from the Ontario Arts Council as part of the Artists in Education program to run projects in schools exploring biodiversity, native plants, and pollination. And I've been working on this for the past 3 years. I work in Guelph, and I'm also working a little bit in Toronto at an ecology-focused school. For these projects, I usually start out introducing students to native plants, biodiversity, pollination, connections between those things. We do a lot of drawing. Some are guided drawings, and some are direct observations from plants and from gardens. So the students learn to identify native plants and pollinators through drawing them. And my classes have hand-bound field guides. They made up little booklets with their drawings in them. They really love drawing the monarch butterflies, so I always include that one. I do make seed paper with them, and then they go on to embroider on their seed paper. So every child in the project chooses their own species that either lives in the native plant garden or would come and visit it, and they do a little bit of research about that species and then embroider that onto their paper. That's the monarch again, but always a favorite. All of the work that I do with my classes is done by hand. The seed making, the paper making, the binding, and also I do as part of the program, I have been putting gardens into the school grounds as well. So everything I do with them is experiential, using the hand. And I have consistently found that my classes are very invested and inspired by working in this experiential way. They really take a huge amount of pride and a sense of accomplishment with what they do. Sewing can be very frustrating, especially for the younger. I usually generally don't really teach it to younger than grade 3, but even with the older students, when you're doing it for the first time, even just threading the needle can be very frustrating. So, and it also wasn't meant to be taught to classes of 28 students. So, although the first few classes can be difficult, I never had a student who hasn't learned to sew by the end of the program and who isn't absolutely thrilled and delighted that they've learned how to do that, male and female. I really do, as an educator, I really do believe in the value of those kinds of experiential activities, not just to engage students in all of their senses, but really to make visceral and tangible connections with curriculum themes and what they're learning. I really value that, and it's not, sometimes it's underused and underrepresented in educational environments, so I'm really happy to be able to bring that, and I'm delighted to work with teachers who are committed to that as well. Hummingbird. And that's a quilt that I put together as one of the classes with all of their embroidery. So this is a slide of one of the gardens that I started. That's at the Branch Avenue Public School. I have consistently done the lasagna bed style of gardening with my students. I find that's a lot easier than getting a class of 28 to dig, and also most schools don't have large sets of shovels. So this has worked really well. I usually we lay out layers of newspaper and then put on top of that layers of straw, compost, leaves, and allow that to biodegrade a little bit. And then our seed paper. And we also do use seedlings and some transplants as well. Those are planted right into the gardens. They love working in the garden. It's really fun. Get dirty. That's a garden at Branch Avenue School that's 2 years after we first planted it. It's very weedy. That's a picture in the fall. I usually weed with them a little bit in the late spring. And many of those plants are from the seed paper, and some are also from seedlings that we grew or transplanted as well. I'm excited always in the spring to see what comes up every year. There's always new surprises. And this is a garden at the Waverly Public School. That's a butterfly garden that was started a number of years ago. It was already on the school grounds when I started doing my projects in the school. It's a really lovely garden and quite big as well. So we've been working to diversify the species in that garden and also to expand it a little bit. In my second year running the program, I had a lot of repeat students. About 75% of my students had done the project the previous year. And this was a really great opportunity actually to really delve into the material and work with them. So I really focused a lot more on the garden. We spent a lot of time doing direct observation, drawing and writing in the garden, starting on seedlings, collecting seed, really doing a lot of that work. And also for the sewing and the artistic component of the program, my students every student in the class made 2 sewn sculptures. So when I say sewn sculpture, I mean something that's 3-dimensional, that's sewn. And the first project that we did was with butterflies, talking a lot about pollinators. So every student in the class made a butterfly sculpture. And again, I used all recycled materials. So we were using fabrics and old clothing for this project. And then each student also, again, chose a native plant, and they researched their plant and made a sewn replica of the plant. So this is can anyone guess what that is in process? It's a wild rose. That's a well rose. Turned out really beautiful. That one you can probably guess. You saw it already up here. That's a butterfly weed. And that's one of the completed installations. It was an ambitious project. I often have students in my classes who have various challenges, fine motor challenges, attention challenges, and the teachers that I was working with, we weren't sure really that every student would be able to complete their sculpture. And I'm really happy to say that every single child that I worked with made and completed a sculpture, and they were so thrilled to do this. So this is the last day of my class with them, and we had a sharing day where we had other classes come and look at the work, and all of my students buddied up with a student from another class and took them around the installation, talked to them about the different plants, the different native species, talked to them about the butterflies and pollinators, and then they went out into the garden. And after working with them for 2 years and coming in and talking every day about native plants and biodiversity and pollination, sometimes even towards the end of the project I was like, not really sure that they were still understanding. Some days I would come in and say, okay, so what is a native plant and why is that important for pollinators and biodiversity? I get a blank classroom. So I wasn't really sure that they were really taking it in and connecting with it. But on the last day of the project, when they really got together with their buddies, it was so exciting to see how much they understood and took in, and but also the maturity with which they spoke about. I was really impressed with the things that they were saying to the other students and their knowledge of biodiversity and pollination. And saying, you should really be planting native plants in your garden and talk to your parents. And so they were so enthusiastic, very invested. And that's a gray-headed coneflower there on the left. And they also took their buddy around the garden to show them the garden and identify various plants and talk about their own writing and observation and drawing. This has been a really great experience for me. I'm so grateful for the opportunity to do this work. It's been very rewarding. I really believe in it. I'm going to talk a little bit about my own work as an artist. The first seed paper installation that I did, it was a large installation, was for the Jazz Festival's Nuit Blanche in 2011. And this installation took place under the Heffernan Street Bridge, which is a public footpath connecting Arthur to Woolwich, and it's just along the Speed River. So for the installation, I made an 8-foot chrysalis. It's all made out of seed paper, so paper embedded with native seeds, and about 250 butterflies they were hung so that they looked as though they were emerging from the chrysalis, and then they were scattered along the path by the Speed River. And really I was thinking in this project a lot about cycles. It was titled Emergence, Recycled Life Cycle. And my reason for using that title was in thinking about, one, in the life cycles of insects, plants, animals, really in life and ecology, we see everything is cyclical. And I feel that often we are very detached. We can be very detached from that in an urban environment, in sort of our current consumer culture. We don't always know where things come from, what happens to them after the time that we use them or are in touch with them. So I really wanted to draw more attention to this and be attentive to the idea of cycles and life cycles. So all of the butterflies were made by hand, and they were hand printed as well, and then hand sewn to sticks. And my reason for using again these craft processes was in one way to contrast how my recycled materials were produced and mass produced, and also to really look critically at how materials, which are essentially fragments of ecology, and also labor, and particularly women's labor. When I say women's labor, that's not intended to exclude men, but activities that are traditionally done by women, and to look at how those are valued in our culture. There's also, to me, an interesting connection in my work between the work that pollinators do and women's work, or those kinds of traditional subsistence activities. And I've thought a lot about how pollinators are essential to a rich life and a rich ecology, and how the work they do is really undervalued. And I think that there's a really interesting connection in that for me with how women's work or subsistence labor is also undervalued and in many ways threatened in our current political and cultural economy. I guess I feel a sense of connection in that way to pollinators. So this project, Emergence, was intended also as a celebration of that work, as a celebration of the work of pollinators, as a celebration of women's work or hand work, working with the hand, and allowed an assertion of the value of that work. In 2000 and what year is this? 13? In 2012, again for Nuit Blanche, as part of the Jazz Festival in the fall, I did another installation, seed paper installation, and this one was done close to the site where John Galt, who is the colonial founder of Guelph, I'm sure you all know who that is in his story, it was close to the site where he felled the first maple tree. If you don't know that story, it's Galt came to Guelph for the first time, chose a big maple, and had this very ceremonious felling of the tree. They cut down the tree as a symbol of the founding of Guelph. I've always found that story and that mythology really interesting. Not a lot of cities have that kind of really mythic story around its beginning, and there's something really interesting to me about that. So for this project, I built a maple tree, and it was intended as a bit of a resurrection of the tree that Galt felled. So the tree, there's a wooden skeletal frame that you can sort of see a little bit there. I credit my husband with most of that work. And then for the bark of the tree, I actually harvested invasive species from both my own property, which is close to the Speed River. I live on Dufferin Street, and also a lot of the invasives that are growing along the Speed River right now and have been replacing what native plants are there. So I harvested those species and used the fiber to create the bark. So I pulped it up and then embedded it with seeds that were native to the riverbanks, close to where the tree was felled. So those paper pieces were then sewn, and you can see that's myself and an artist, a wonderful Guelph artist, Janet Morton, who graciously helped me. We sewed those onto the frame of the tree. And that's the bark. You can see the texture in there of the seeds and the fiber as well. I like to put all the leaves and stems and everything in there too. I just really like the organic look of it. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with the site, but the river run is behind the tree there. It's along Woolwich Street. The stone that you saw was the old facade of the Speed River, the old skating rink. And then the Speed River is in behind. And It's not on the site where the tree was felled because that happens to be the intersection of Macdonell and, where's it, Woolwich, but it's very close to that site. And I did have a sound installation. There was a sound piece that played from the interior of the tree. And when I first thought of doing the project, a friend of mine said, you have to read Galt's autobiography. You just have to read it. It's so interesting. So I went to the library and I looked specifically at the piece about him felling the tree. And I was really astounded at what he wrote. He was a writer, he was a novelist. And the poignancy and also the consciousness with which he wrote about the felling of the tree was really interesting. He described it as the death of the wild, as the death of nature. And he talked about the sound of the tree falling, echoing in the forest as the sound of a coffin being lowered in the grave. So when I read that, I thought, well, I couldn't have put it better myself. That's exactly how I feel about this mythology. And so that was really interesting to me. I wanted to look really consciously at that mythology that we have in our city as a point of revelation about the roots of our relationship with land and about how we relate to the ecology where we live. So for the sound piece, I took quotes from his autobiography and I mixed them with sounds from along the riverbank near where the tree was felled. And I also wrote a piece about the history of that land, and specifically the history of that tree and the land around it, from the perspective of the land itself. And that was sort of mixed up with the quotes from Galt and the river sounds. It was intended as a bit of a mishmash of stories to sort of really challenge that colonial narrative and look at it from a different perspective. After the installation came down, I planted the pieces in various locations close to the Speed River, so all the bark pieces were planted into gardens. Partially because I tend to take on these massive projects, and partially because it's really important to the way that I want to work. I usually tend to have work bees or work parties around different aspects of the creation. So I did work with a group of local moms and their kids in the planting. We made a little garden out of the bark pieces and put in seedlings as well. And that's really important to the way that I work. I think those kinds of work bees are really an opportunity, a really interesting opportunity for passing on and sharing knowledge and skills and really fostering conversation around gardening, around biodiversity, and how we relate to our landscape. And there's also a real connection with the history of quilting bees and working collectively, collective labor. I just thought that was a really sweet little picture. So the last thing, I'm just going to talk for a couple of minutes. I wanted to talk a little bit about my next project that I have coming up. I'm very thrilled to have been the recipient of an Ontario Arts Council Integrated Arts Projects grant, which I received this spring. And I'm going to be working in collaboration with Pollination Symposium on a project on the Eastview landfill site. So for this project, I'm going to be making quite a large-scale seed paper quilt, and I'll also be working with a local wonderful writer and poet, Anna Bowen, who's in the room today. Some of you may have heard her read at the Eden Mills Writers Festival last summer. And Anna's going to be producing a series of poetry vignettes about the history of that particular site, the layered history of the site, and also about my work on the site in the project. And the selected image and text from her writing will be sewn and printed on the quilt, and the entire quilt will be sewn and installed on site on the Eastview landfill site, and the site will be open to the public. There will probably be some participation as well. So that's a project that I'm really excited about, and that will likely be happening in the spring and summer of 2014. And if you are interested in that project and being updated about it, please see me after the presentation. I can make sure that you get any information about when that's coming up. And lastly, I just wanted to say, part of the foundation of my work is really the belief that in interdisciplinarity. So the belief that making connections between disciplines can provide a really important opportunity for multiple points of access into thinking about specific issues. In this case, thinking about gardening, pollination differently. And what I've found is if we're speaking as an artist or particularly only an environmentalist, that can be a barrier for some people who don't identify with that at all. And so I've found in my projects that the interdisciplinary nature of them has allowed for some people greater access into thinking about and working with different ideas. And I really believe in that, so that's it. I think we have time for a few questions, if there are any.
I'm just wondering how you hang things. What do you use to hang them? How do you get them up there?
Are you speaking about
Especially the butterflies.
the butterfly piece?
That are on the
Yeah, with lots of help.
Yeah.
I'm afraid of heights, actually. So for this piece, both the pieces that I worked with a local contractor as well, because that's not my expertise. So what did we do? So we threw a rope up to the top. You can see the concrete bars going across there. We threw a rope up and made a pulley system and pulleyed I think actually the contractor might have gotten up on a ladder and secured that, and then we pulleyed the chrysalis up. And then with the butterflies, we had set out, there's quite a bit of lawn. I'm not a proponent of lawns, but it was really useful for the project. There's quite a long line beside the tracks there of lawn. And so we made quite a long string of fishing wire, and we tied individually all of the butterflies to the fishing wire. And I think there were about 5 of us, and all together we also hoisted that up and tied it to various points. I'm really into collaboration, partially because of the nature of my projects. I don't always have the skills. I have ideas that I really want to see, and I don't always have the skills to make them happen. So I've been really fortunate to be able to collaborate with some brilliant people. Often I'll go to people and say, I want to hang an 8-foot chrysalis and 200 butterflies. And they'll say, oh, you're crazy, that's impossible. But I've learned which contractors say, okay, I think I know how we can do that. So I'm lucky to work with some brilliant people.
I'm curious to know if you collaborated with the people at the bottom at the bridge.
Oh, you mean the folks who were out on, yeah, sure. I didn't collaborate with them, but we did, this is a really interesting area to me. Both spaces, I walk a lot here along the river. And this space in particular, yeah, it is used, there are a lot of needles and other things in that space, and it is used as a gathering space. And so I really wanted to see something very beautiful there and interesting. And it really did. I really found everyone who walked past, both while I was at the site and while we were putting it up, it really engaged people in conversation. You know, wow, what is this? What is this about? Wow, this is crazy. So it provides a really interesting way to talk about things and say, well, this is the work and this is what it's about. People that I otherwise certainly would not be having conversations about biodiversity or pollinators. So, yeah.
Can you tell us precisely where it is? Because I'm a walker and I wonder if
Yeah. This one,
yeah.
the Chrysalis? Okay, so along the Speed River, I mean, Pollination Well talked earlier about the, what's it called?
Trans-Canada.
The Trans-Canada Trail, which runs from Aramosa to Speedville. Do you know where that is? Okay, so I don't know if it's still the Trans-Canada Trail, but that path continues on the other side of Aramosa. So going down in the direction of downtown, there's a path and it's along the railway still. And this is under the footbridge that goes across to Arthur Street. It's a pedestrian bridge.
Would that be the one that is near River Run?
It's very close to River Run. Yeah.
Right behind St. George's Church.
Yes, right behind St. George's Church.
Maybe you should explain what Nuit Blanche is.
Oh, does everyone know what Nuit Blanche is?
It had a life cycle.
Yeah, so Nuit Blanche is the Contemporary Jazz Festival. They have, as part of their programming, they've been putting on an interdisciplinary arts event, so music, visual arts, dance, pretty much everything in the arts you can imagine. So this was part of Nuit Blanche. I was hoping to leave the installation up. I wouldn't have used the fishing wire, I would have used something else, but I was hoping to actually leave it up and let the butterflies biodegrade and seed a little bit on the bank, on the river banks. They gave me 24 hours. The city gave me 24 hours, so unfortunately I couldn't do that. But it's a really fun 24 hours.
I don't know if you talked about the significance or the symbolism of burying all your art as an artist, like in the artist community. What does that mean? And like people that you work with in workshops and kids who are making beautiful paper, how do they feel about just burying it all?
Sure. Yes, the question was about the significance of burying your artwork in an artist community, or also with children, working with children. How do they feel about burying the beautiful things that they've made? So to be honest, the seed paper quilts, what I've done in my classes is I don't bury their embroidery. Because they are so proud and delighted, and they want to take them home. So what we've done is they stitch their embroidery onto the cover of their field guides that they've made. With the older classes, I should mention, they do story writing. So they're writing stories about whatever species, about the pollinators, about the plants. And I also, as part of the program, I'm always telling stories as part of the introduction to different species and their connections and interactions. So they really want to take those home, and that's fine, but we make extra paper, and we bury those. And always, I always have students who say, what? We're gonna bury this? But it's really fun, too. And I don't know, for me myself as an artist, I find it really rewarding. I'm really interested, I'm interested in life cycles and the cycles of things. And I mean, it's really interesting to spend 200 hours making something and to bury it and only have a photograph. It's kind of pretty crazy, but it also is rewarding because there is this sense that it has its own life that's outside of me as well. So it takes on its own life cycle, and there's something really, it's a different kind of reward, but there's something really rewarding about that as well.
In your projects with the children in schools, do you find some seeds are more successful than others?
With the paper, or just in general?
No, with the paper.
Yeah, definitely. Last question? Oh, sorry. The question was, in my projects in the schools and with the seed paper, do I find that some seeds are more successful than others in the paper? And the answer is yes. The two seeds that I've found are most successful are wild bergamot, seems to do really well in the paper, and also evening primrose. It comes up crazy. And yeah, some seeds, particularly the grasses, I find don't do well. The one challenge I've found about working with the paper is the paper really does suck the moisture. So you really have to keep it moist. And I've been thinking, and particularly for the project on the landfill site, I've really been thinking about what can I do to make the paper more viable. And I did consider maybe adding peat to the paper, which as an environmentalist I don't feel great about, but I'd be really interested to hear from anyone else if they had any ideas about alternatives, because that is a challenge, because the paper does get quite dry. It needs extra water.
I'm just wondering, you've worked with adults and with children. Do you find the response is pretty much the same across the age groups, or do you find there's a difference in how adults and children respond to the work? Because it's similar, they're doing stitching, handwork, planting.
Yeah, I mean, I would say the response is sorry, thank you. The question was, do I find the response from children and adults is similar, because I worked with both groups to the projects. And the answer is no, because everybody responds differently. Particularly in my adult workshops, I've had participants that are like, this is so exciting and what a great idea and I really love this. I had one woman attend a workshop who, she said, why would you do this? I really don't, she kept saying, I really don't understand why you would make something and put it in the ground. Or why would you put something in the ground that you've made? Like she couldn't wrap her mind around that. So yeah, I do get a different response. And that's really interesting. It sort of challenges our ideas about what art is, and also about what is a garden. What are we putting into our gardens? What kinds of intentions are we putting in there? So, with my students, I've never had, surprisingly, I've never had a student who hasn't enjoyed the program. I'm always asked well, how is it with boys? Like, do they like the sewing, or are they bored? No, not at all. I just find they're just so excited to work with their hands, to learn a new skill, to get out into the garden, and to do something also as a group, so they're having this sense of individual and also collective accomplishment. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Yeah, the response certainly varies. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Christina. It was really interesting. We shall now look forward to your quilting on the Fernando side. So we would like to just offer you a token of our invitation, and thank you very much for coming today. So.